this vodcast hosted by Theology and Religious Studies at the University of Glasgow in our Hope Against Hope series, exploring spirituality in the context of climate change. My name is Heather Walton, and I'm delighted to introduce two speakers working in different academic fields with very different faith traditions and historical contexts. They've nevertheless found much to share and discuss as they focus upon chaos, blood and resilience. Our first presenter, Ariel Zinder, is a poet and literary scholar based at Tel Aviv University. His work explores the interface between literary and historical traditions and the urgent questions that provoke us to address the divine today. Ophira Gamliel is a South Asianist who specialises in querulous culture and history and intercommunal resilience and solidarity in the face of severe environmental challenges, particularly flooding. Ariel, I'd like to invite you to present.
Thank you very much, Heather. And it's good to be with you, and hello to our viewers. These are very profound and serious times. I was listening to the opening speeches of the convention in Glasgow, and the great drama is apparent and obvious. And what's also obvious is that what we have at the moment are mostly words, and that is how at the time we're trying to further our care of the planet and its climate. So coming from the Jewish tradition, which is a highly verbal one, in which most of the rituals are verbal and the study is verbal, and we keep going back to the same texts. That is something that I'm sort of struggling with at the time and trying to understand how can we bridge the gap between our verbal abilities and the action that one needs to take while facing the climate crisis. So the way those questions meet my recent research, I've been working, and this is an ongoing conversation with Ophira as well, about the notion of God's voice, and especially God's discourse, how we as humans, or in the early ages, prophets and so on, represented God as a dramatic persona. What does he say? What doesn't he say? In what tense does he speak? And so on. And as I'm working, I came upon two interesting paradoxes regarding God's voice. And what I'll show in a moment is how these paradoxes relate to notions of climate and action. So one paradox is the fact that as much as the God's voice is a great sort of central hero of the Hebrew Bible, there are many stories in that Hebrew Bible which account for not listening to God's voice. God's voice is supposed to be this definite, profound, powerful voice that can move people and create wars or prevent wars and create floods and create the sun and so on. But the various stories very early on from the beginning of Genesis are also a detailed account of how humans hear that voice and disregard it. So that's one paradox. The other, which is more apparent in later generations of the Jewish tradition, is the fact that Jews kept representing God as a speaker, even after there were no more official prophets. In the time of the Talmud and the Midrash, sort of creative homilies, and the area which I study mostly is liturgical poetry. So people would come to the synagogue and hear a poem which represents, for instance, the people of Israel crying for help and God and God's reply to them. But even as they were doing this, even as they were representing God's voice, there were all kinds of techniques to represent that voice as a voice which is still awaited. It's a future voice. Even if we hear it now, that is only an inkling or a glimpse of the full sound, which will appear in the future. So there's a sort of a strong linkage between God's voice and a notion of waiting. And actually in Hebrew, the word for hope, this series is called Hope Against Hope. And the word in Hebrew for hope, which is to hope, is lekavot. A synonym of that is just to wait and to be patient. The etymology of lekavot, the Hebrew word, is quite a beautiful one. It comes from kav, which is a line. So one is supposed to sort of stand erect and look out into the world and await the great hero or the great salvation which will come. So once again, it's a paradox because God's voice is profound and powerful, but it is in the future. It is awaited. So what I thought I could contribute to our conversation about spiritual traditions and the climate crisis is two very small examples of how those two paradoxes manifest themselves with relation to crisis of climate. One famously the flood, Noah's flood and Noah's Ark, and the other in the book of Job. So these are the famous verses from the book of Genesis. And God said unto Noah, come thou and all thy house into the ark. So this is God speaking directly to a human being in a time of a great moral crisis and an upcoming climate crisis. And God goes on and says, for thee have I seen righteous before me in this generation. And as the chapter goes on, we learn that Noah did according unto all that God commanded him. So far, so good. God speaks, reveals some terrible truth to a human being, in this case, Noah, and that human being responds. He takes that as the voice of truth and begins this unbelievable project of building the ark. There are nice homilies in the Jewish tradition that depict how it took Noah 120 years to build the ark, and people kept coming up to him and saying, what are you doing? And he had all these prophecies about the flood, and they didn't believe him, and so on. So far, so good. However, as we read the next verses, there's a small sort of shift. So Noah was 600 years old when the flood of waters was upon the earth, and Noah went in, and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him into the ark. So far, so good. However, there are a few more words in that verse. And the words are, he went in because of the waters of the flood. We would think that he went in because of God's command, but he went in because of the waters of the flood. And there were commentators already in the Middle Ages, for instance, Rashi and others, who were saying the following: Noah was of those who are wanting in faith. The Hebrew actually is small in faith, ktanei emunah. He believed and he did not believe that the flood would come, and he would not enter the ark until the waters forced him to do so. So we're invited to imagine Noah waiting until the waters of the flood reach his knees, supposedly, and then he says, okay, I'll go in now. So what we're faced with is this chasm between, and God said, this divine revelation of a terrible truth and an urgent action that needs to be taken. And on the other hand, the fact that what actually motivated Noah in this instance was something else, was the actual physical proof of the flood, and maybe just his very human fear of death. So this is one example of that sort of paradox where God's voice is so important and so full of knowledge and so full of truth, while on the other hand, what actually motivates people in the Bible is sometimes something else. And I think many of us could relate to this and ask ourselves, what is it exactly that has to bridge this gap between the knowledge of an upcoming crisis and what would actually motivate us? So that's one example. I'll have a few more words to say about that in a minute, but I'll go over to the next example, which once again is a second paradox, that even as God is speaking, his voice is supposedly a future voice, still awaited. One of the places where one can see this very clearly is in the book of Job, which really is a unique book because unlike other books where God is part of the drama and he speaks to prophets, he speaks to the forefathers and so on, at the beginning of the book of Job, we're invited to understand that God has his own kingdom, and on the earth, it's just a dialogue between Job and his three friends. As the dialogue between all four of them goes on, the matter of what God will say or who will say what is very, very central. So let's just see two very small examples of what the friends say to Job. So this is Job 7. This is Bildad, one of the three friends of Job, and he addresses Job and says, "For inquire, I pray thee, of the former generation, and apply thyself so that which their fathers have searched out. Shall not they teach thee and tell thee and utter words out of their heart?" And now he quotes supposedly what they would say, what the older fathers would say. They would address Job and say, "Can the rush shoot up without mire? Can the reed grass grow without water?" Or in other words, if you are suffering, can that happen if you have not sinned? So what's central here, I think, is the fact that Bildad has a very strict notion of the truth. And he connects that with something that will be said, might be said to Job. He directs Job to the former generation, to the elders, and he's absolutely sure that this is what they'll say. The next example, which is quite similar, from another of Job's friends, is in Job 11. This is Ophira speaking. And he says to Job, "And thou hast said, my doctrine is pure and I am clean in thine eyes. But oh, that God would speak and open his lips against thee." So Ophira has a very clear understanding that God should speak and educate Job. But what's really important is the fact that Ophira is absolutely sure that he knows what God would say. And that's why he goes on and says, "And that he would tell thee the secrets of wisdom, that sound wisdom is manifold. Know that therefore that God exacts of thee less than thine iniquity deserves." So Ophira awaits God's voice as he is absolutely sure what that voice would say. And I think that many religious communities can relate to that kind of a sentiment, for better or for worse, that we have some supposition of what God would say to us in a certain situation. It's a wonderful aspect of the religious frame of mind, that we are, an ear is sort of open to unspoken words and to an unspoken truth. But it can also, of course, be very devastating. And God's voice can be misused. And one would say that I am sure that God would say such and such. And we know that to be a fact from our own world. So these are the two friends awaiting a certain speech and knowing for certain what that speech would be. Let's see how Job addresses the same question. Job answered and said, "No doubt ye are the people, and wisdom shall die with you. But ask now the beasts, and they shall teach thee, and the fowls of the air, and they shall tell thee. Or speak to the earth, and it shall teach thee, and the fishes of the sea shall declare unto thee. Who knows not amongst this, that the hand of God hath wrought this?" So this is, one could say, the same form. Job addresses his friends and says, "You are wrong, I am right." And I can cite a future speech of someone that will absolutely justify my position. What's fascinating, of course, is that he cites the earth and the birds and the fish and so on. And it's very clear that Job is replying to Bildad and saying, "You want me to address the elders, but in my crisis, the elders have nothing important to say. I have to turn to a different form of authority." But once again, even Job assumes that he knows what the birds and the fish and the earth will say. This whole drama of a future speech comes to an end as God eventually appears from the whirlwind and says the following. God answered Job out of the whirlwind, and he addresses Job and says, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Who shut up the sea with doors when it broke forth and issued out of the womb? When I made the cloud the garment thereof, and thick darkness a swaddling band for it, and prescribed for it my decree, and set bars and doors. So these are very famous verses where God sets Job straight and says, you should think twice before you assume that you know something, because I am the one who created the world. What I would emphasize, and in line with the previous questions, is the next verse in God's speech. And he says, I addressed the sea. I shut up the sea with doors and said, this is God speaking of himself, I said to the sea, thus far shalt thou come, but no further, and here shall thy proud waves be stayed. So this is not a future speech. This is a speech that was done in the past, and it's still apparent for everyone standing at the beach. You stand at the beach and you're amazed at the fact that the ocean can come so far and not actually flood the earth. And what God is trying to say is that if you wouldn't assume what I'm thinking, if you would just look at the seashore, for instance, you would know that I'm holding this ocean and I'm preventing it from flooding you, but I can also open my hand or open the bar and the door, and you will be flooded. So unlike all you humans who sort of triumphantly think that you know what I will say and know what I will do, this is God's position. So these are very sort of brief incursions into two ways of God speaking and how humans react to it. I have to say that my own conclusion from these thoughts is quite embarrassing. I'm myself a man of faith, and I try to use that to direct my life. But these stories and these monologues and these speeches are a serious challenge to our religious upbringing and to the way we use those resources to cope with serious crises like the climate crisis. And I think perhaps the key would be to stop assuming what God would say and say, for the moment, we will live in that gap between his words and our actions and try to solve something. Eventually, what I would suggest actually comes not from the Bible and not from the Jewish tradition, but from King Lear, in the famous dialogue between King Lear and Gloucester, when King Lear says, you see how this world goes, and Gloucester says, I see it feelingly because he's blind. And King Lear answers, a man may see how this world goes with no eyes. Look with thine ears. So my paraphrase would be, a man or a humankind can see how this, can hear how this world goes with no ears. We can hear God speaking to us in this present climate crisis, but we shouldn't necessarily listen with our ears, but listen with our eyes. So that'll be it for now.
Thank you very much, Ariel. So much richness there. We will have a chance to discuss it later, but now I'm going to invite Ophira to give her presentation. Ophira?
So I'm also going to talk about floods. And I must admit that in regards to hope, I think it's not really relevant. It's not relevant whether we are hoping or despairing. I think we need some kind of clarity and also listening to the voices of people who are being affected for many years, whether they are in Indonesia or in Kerala, the place that I'm studying. And it's, even though it's difficult, they're not speaking English mostly, but I think we should try and listen to what they have to say and their experience and think about religion and faith and ritual and religious literature and prayer and so forth and so on in terms of organization, human organization, so as to deal with the crisis that is unfolding before our eyes. And this is what brings me into this conversation, is seeing the place I was living and studying the language Malayalam for several years in the past being flooded, and losing contact with my friends there for a good few days and being very distressed and feeling despair when watching the news coming from Kerala when it was flooded. So I'm trying to engage from my field, religious studies and literature and the language of Kerala with those voices. So first of all, I'm going to talk about epic floods, but also about real floods. And just a few words about Kerala. As you can see, Kerala is here. And this is how the rainfall map image taken by NASA in 2018, August 13th to 20th. This is how the place looked like. The whole country was flooded. There were lots of refugees, millions of people displaced in relief centers. It was really, really dramatic. The term for floods in Malayalam, in the Malayalam language, is Velapokam. And the epic floods is pralayam, mahapralayam. And sometimes when such a flood disaster occurs, they are also using the term mahapralayam, the flood of the end of times. As opposed to the biblical floods, the floods in Indic religions is something cyclical. Whenever creation reaches its end, just before it goes back to sleep with God, then a flood occurs, the whole world disappears underwater. And I think this kind of idea of an epic flood is related to real floods occurring in South Asia. So we are talking about extreme weather events when they occur. This is how it looks like. It's really, really traumatic and very difficult to the people stranded in the floods. Those currents are very strong. And you see the men here trying to pull, the boat with the women and rescue them. And this kind of collective traumatic events that so many people shared in effort to help each other creates disaster narratives. And my hypothesis is that this is embedded at some point in epic floods narratives. So, but disaster narratives can be very immediate. People just tell you what happened to them, and it expresses a collective trauma that is processed over time, I believe, into this kind of mystical experience and the presence of God and the feeling that God is talking to you or helping you in some way in that moment of stress and despair. So we have the flood myth in Sanskrit epics, in the Mahabharata or others also. There are lots of versions of the flood myths in which God becomes a big fish and rescues humanity from the flood. This is what you can see here. And I argue that this kind of perception of God rescuing humanity from the flood has a lot to do with those disaster cycles, flood cycles of rescue and survival that people really experience. Okay, so just a few words about the flood myth in the Mahabharata, and this is what kind of attracted my attention, because in that flood story, at first I was more interested in the speech of God embedded therein many years ago, but now I kind of revisited it in order to examine the relation to God's speech and the flood experience. So what we have in this regard is the sage Markandeya. He remains alone, he's immortal. So when the flood of the end of times, the Mahapralayam, sweeps the whole world, he is floating alone, very dejected, in great despair, because everything is lost. And all of a sudden, he sees a tree growing in the midst of this nothingness of water, a huge ocean, and the child sits on the tree, and he's really amazed. He looks at the child, and immediately the child swallows him, and he sees the whole universe inside the child, which is also quite shocking. And so the child vomits him back into external existence, and this kind of vomiting and externalizing of something that is in the belly or in the body of God, basically. This is also the idea of creation in Indic religions. And so the child addresses Markandeya, the saint, the immortal saint, identifying himself as Vishnu Narayana, with a self-praise hymn, in the sense of he's praising himself as the deity. And just a few verses out of these self-praise hymns, he says, I am the eternal origin, unchanging, called Narayana, the creator of all creatures and their destroyer. I tread the three worlds, being the self of all, delighting all the worlds. So basically, I am also inside you, everyone who listens to me. I am above all while existing everywhere, the eternal mind of the mighty strides. All the gem-producing oceans in all directions know that they are my garment, my bed, and my dwelling place. So here, the deity identifies, unlike the Jewish God, the deity identifies as my body is this whole world. I'm not out of it, I'm a part of it. And then we have this very kind of touching a few verses that I believe give us a hint about this experience of survival and rescue. Once identified as God, and here you can see the sage Markandeya worshiping God as God, and notice the child on the tree. This is the creator God, by the way, God Brahma with the four heads, and Lakshmi, the wife of God, massaging his feet. So once he's identified as God, he also tells Markandeya the following: when you saw the whole world destroyed, with all animate and inanimate beings transformed into one single ocean, I realized you were upset and revealed it to you. When you entered my body, you saw the whole world inside me, you were astonished and bewildered. Therefore, I quickly emitted you through my mouth. I explained to you my own self beyond the grasp of both demons and God. So here we have this kind of, I'm trying to rationalize the disaster experience and trying to explain, you know, to the poor, hapless survivor what is going on. Okay, and now I would like to speak a little bit about flood ballads in Arabic Malayalam. Even though it's a different tradition, it's the same experience. And different tradition in the sense that it is spoken by Muslims in Kerala, a place that is prone to flooding. The 2018 flood was not the first one. There was a big flood in 1924 that everybody recalled and remembered when the 2018 floods hit them. And there is a documentation in newspaper articles, etc., and Malayalam short stories and lots of different narratives. And pictures. I could even find pictures online like this one. It was really, really a disastrous event. And in 1961, there was another flood disaster that was somewhat forgotten for some reason, but the Arabic Malayalam poets, they remembered. And there is a very interesting text for the 1924 floods and another one for the 1961. And I would like to spend a few minutes talking about these two. What is Arabic Malayalam? It's the Malayalam language written in the Malabari Arabic script. From on the right side, you can see an image of a text of a famous devotional poem called Qasidat al-Burda from the 13th century, and written in the Malabari script, which is somewhat stylized according to the local scribes and local taste. It's quite difficult to read, but luckily, this Arabic Malayalam flood ballad from 1924 was reproduced in the Malayalam script, also with some modern Malayalam commentary, which is very helpful because Arabic Malayalam, even when it is in the Malayalam script, is very difficult to decipher sometimes. So by the poet Uni Muhammad Mundambra, this Velapokam flood, that's the name of the story, it's 72 chapters, and there's a mixture of prose and metrical verses, which is also very interesting. And the edition by Abin Shah and Kem Abdullah also gained from the talent of Ashik Abu Bakr, who drew pictures, who drew illustrations for this print. So this is what you see here. The imagination in 2015, it was published, the imagination of how the flood looks like. And here is the prose section from Vela Pokam, Flood. This is a part that the poet in Vela Pokam, Mundambra Unimamad, describes all that happened in small villages or bigger places. Some are not so famous, others are very famous, along the Chalia River in 1924, and this section is where it reaches his village. So he shifts to prose and he starts describing in lengthy details what was happening, how people organized, and that's why I found it especially interesting, this section. So he's now talking about the discussion in his village about the fact that they are all stranded and the rice is finished. They are going to starve and they're thinking what to do. And some people suggest that they will take a boat, sail to Calicut, the bigger town, and try and purchase rice there for everybody. As these matters were reported to the market town leaders, they all said in great distress, the whole country has been covered as if by an ocean. If you sail now to Calicut, you risk drifting into the ocean without reaching Calicut, and therefore, even if we all starve here to death, we will definitely won't be sending you now to get rice grains and other supplies in the current situation. Hearing of the disrupted plan to sail to Calicut, one of them said, if I go to help the unfortunate people, and since I firmly believe that the all-merciful God will protect me, I will reach Calicut safely, purchase the rice, and return immediately, inshallah. So here we can see how faith is motivating this kind of rescue operation. Hearing this courageous statement, the leaders decided there was no use in objecting. They deposited issues such as worry, anxiety, and distress in the golden box of trust in Allah and locked it with the key of the prayer. Oh Allah, take care of our needs. And thus it was agreed to permit this righteous person to take the journey to Calicut. Just to clarify, it's not that everybody in the village are Muslims. Yes, there were Christians there, there were Hindus there. It was a joint kind of effort. But the way that is the faith is moving the people to the rescue of everybody else, I think this is worthwhile thinking about. And I also would like you to hear a little bit how it sounds. This is the cover of the Malayalam edition with the beautiful paintings by Ashik Abu Bakr. And Abin Shah was generous enough to record a few verses for me so that I can hear how it sounds. Because this, you have to remember, is performed. It's not just a written composition, it is performed. Probably it is also the way that the narration is composed is by improvisation. So just to hear how it sounds like, this verse is, groups of people were stranded on hills and treetops, crying out loud, and for their rescue, some people reached out to so many trapped girls and children with their mothers struggling to put them on boats. People moved their belongings to higher grounds.
കരഞ്ഞും കൊണ്ടേറിയ കുന്നുമരങ്ങളിലും കയറിട്ടൊടുക്കിയാൻ കശിയാതുള്ള കൂട്ടരെ രക്ഷപ്പെടുത്തിടുവാൻ ചില പേർ തുണഞ്ഞവർ ഏറ്റം തരുണികളാൽ അണഞ്ഞതിൽ കേറ്റി പിള്ളകളാൽ തുനിഞ്ഞതി പോറ്റും തള്ളകളാൽ കെണിഞ്ഞതൽക്കാരെ അണയാതെ ഇടങ്ങളിൽ ചേർത്തിട സ്വത്തുകളാൽ.
So now I would like, if it's okay, to spend a few more minutes with Pulikotil Haider's Velapo Kamala from 1961. This one, as I said, is a forgotten flood, which is interesting, but the poet composed a much shorter Arabic Malayalam composition to commemorate this flood. And this is just two verses from his composition, just to imagine what is in their minds. What you see here, I couldn't find any images online. I told you it was like a forgotten flood. So this image is from 2018, the Western Ghat and the destruction around it. And I selected it because I would also like to kind of emphasize how nature is kind of claiming back its place in the places where people live, and etc. And the poet refers to that. So he says, then came the news of the massive disaster that befell. I am telling this long story for people to know in the future. And this is the kind of idea, you know, that we are aestheticizing the disaster because we want people to listen, to know what happened, and to be prepared for the future. So a boat capsized with a huge number of people drowning. The corpses of the dead were dug out by hands out of the mud. And again, I would really like to emphasize that this is a real, you know, it's a very, very traumatic, it's a disastrous event, a floods. And it's difficult to convey the trauma involved and the difficulties of experiencing it just by looking at, you know, at images in news items, etc., and also, of course, of the data. And here is a section that I would like you to also listen to. And this is about the nature, you know, after a flood, people, when they start cleaning the mud from their houses, they find all kinds of snakes, dangerous snakes, and diseases are there in that mud. So it's not only that, you know, the water recedes and then everything can get back to normal. It's a dangerous stuff what remains after the flood. And this verse conveys that kind of the nature and civilization becoming intermingled and becoming upside down. Moreover, the poet says, a snake from the eastern mountain came afloat and fixed its camp on a tree. Then one mighty crocodile floated and devoured a buffalo calf that fell and got swept with the flood water. And this is how this verse sounds. Okay, so just to kind of sum up this issue, this is the verse that she sang. This is, I think, where we can become a bit more practical from our perspectives as religious studies scholars and scholars of literature and culture. There is a concept developed in the UN called links, local and indigenous knowledge systems. And I think that that's where we can come in with, you know, thinking about the intersections of culture, history, and religion with disaster resilience and climate change adaptation. And disasters in disaster management studies and research have cycles. They have the cycles of preparedness, response, and recovery. Risk perception is very important for preparedness, for example. So tacit knowledge, such as that that is conveyed via aestheticized forms of disaster narratives like the Arabic Malayalam flood ballads, or even epic traditions, is the kind of knowledge we need for risk perception of communities in order to be prepared for such disasters to occur. And what we have also is, you know, it implies what we hear from when God speaks to the persons in times of crisis, or when poets describe what happened in their area. This is about the response and human organizations. We need issues such as self-sacrifice and help and support of others, etc., etc. And finally, those stories are very important for the final, not final, but the third stage, so to speak, of recovery, because it's such a traumatic event that telling the story, aestheticizing it, performing it, is also very important for the collective mental well-being of the community. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very, very much, both of you. And I'm sure there's much that you want to discuss with each other. I was very, very struck by the fact that in both your presentations, trauma opens up space in which you have to reconceptualize your relation to God or the divine or what is sacred. And also that space involves rethinking relation to nature, to the natural forces in which we are immersed. Ophira has a much more, in a sense, practical view of religion working in that way. So I wonder if we can start there by discussing the space that trauma opens up and the type of responses that faith traditions make to that. Ariel, I wonder if you'd like to begin.
Thank you. Well, yeah, I have a lot of questions for Ophira, and also relating to what I said. I have to say that I'm almost a bit envious of that form of a tradition, or I'd like to adopt some of it or learn from it, because, as I said earlier, I think that there is. You could suppose a Jewish tradition discusses trauma quite profoundly, because I mean, one of the founding events of post-biblical Jewish tradition was the destruction of the temple, which is regarded ritually, religiously, philosophically as a forming trauma of all that was to come. But I think there's this. One could see, at least in many traditions that I can think of, in many sort of forms of Jewish tradition, a way of acknowledging the trauma, but sometimes quite quickly covering it up. And in that sense, being aware to the space that trauma can open up, but then finding all kinds of ways to contract it because it's too difficult to live with that. So one could even see that. I mean, I think that would be the narrative of the book of Job, because Job has suffered an enormous, unbelievable trauma, and his friends keep trying in all kinds of ways to close that gap and to give the trauma a reason, or to give it a form of hope, and to, in all kinds of ways, to move away from the present understanding, the profound understanding of trauma, to other narratives and to other forms of thinking, while Job really insists on remaining within the space of trauma. So I mean, if I could think of anything in the Jewish tradition that resembles what Ophira just spoke about, as sort of a cautionary tale, an aestheticization of trauma for future events, I would say that would be the book of Job. But how many of us are able to truly listen to it and truly sort of pull ourselves out of what we're used to thinking and reshuffling our thought completely? I'm not sure there are many of us who are courageous enough to do that. That's what's heavily on my mind in these days of COP. I think we're in those kinds of days, and the question is whether we, as believers and our leaders especially, will be able to open up a completely new and to dismantle previous ways of thinking and to reveal a new way of thinking, which is extremely, extremely difficult. But I believe that's where we're standing now. As long as we can stay within the space that trauma, or the notion of future trauma, can open up, I think that we'd be on the right path.
Ophira, I'm reminded that Amitav Ghosh talks about responses to trauma being aided by knowledge of a previous trauma. Having experienced a trauma in the past, in a sense, Amitav claims, opens up space to reflect on current trauma. And that seems to be something of the message that was coming through in your presentation. How would you like to respond to Ariel?
Yeah, I'll try to be kind of pointed, and I'm not sure I can, because I feel like there's a lot of room for much longer discussion that we can than we can afford here. But first of all, about trauma, even though I use the term, you know, I cannot avoid thinking of its origins. I think it comes from traum, which means a dream, right? So there is a sense of it's not really entirely real, right? And I use the term, but I feel that I would prefer the experience. And the experience not of a single person is important here, but of communities and groups and historical, you know, historical connections, even if it goes back into Mesopotamian, you know, epic flood narrative or Sanskrit epic flood narratives. What I feel is that as humans, we have engraved in our collective consciousness, if you like, the idea that this all can end. You know, whether it is a destruction of a temple of a nation that is being processed as the disaster of a group of people going out to exile, occupied, you know, oppressed by another nation, etc., or a war, or whether it is an earthquake or a flood or a volcano erupting or a plague, right? We just are kind of collectively experiencing the COVID. There is something really here that we can talk about. And I think that the question is, and that relates to Amitav Ghosh, what I read in Amitav Ghosh, is how we kind of manage to create civilization and hegemonic culture, you can say, that manages to sweep all these issues aside. I think this is the real mystery here, because it looks like in history we had it. All religious traditions have engraved in there this kind of sense of the world might come to an end, you know. It's not happening somewhere in the future. And also I would like to remind ourselves that we as humans, we have this kind of idea that we are the crown of creation or something that is, but we are animals. You know, we are animals. And what happens with animals when they consume the resources in their territory is that they start, you know, there is a disaster happening, the disaster of exploitation of resources and so forth and so on. And I think that this is one of the things that one of the criticism against the world leaders now gathering in the COP is that they are not really, they don't seem to be in a hurry. They feel as if millions dying already because of climate change issues. Climate refugees is a big issue, and there was one of the discussions in the Hope Against Hope series was around refugees. Climate refugees is a big issue. This is happening, and it has been happening for the past 2 or 3 decades already. It's just that managing to keep those in power aloof of the consequences of this disaster. This is, I think, the mystery we should address. And perhaps, I don't know, perhaps the faith traditions can move these people into actions if they are afraid of the consequences, not of everybody else dying and they are being rescued in some ark or something, but the consequences, facing the consequences of ignoring the plight and closing their hearts, you know, to listen to the immediate experiences and the plights of I know hundreds of millions of people right now suffering, you know. I know, I hope it made sense. I felt it was a bit too difficult to, you know, kind of pack an answer that is very concise and direct.
I'd just like to give Ariel a chance to respond. We're reaching the end of our time now, but Ariel?
I must say that Ophira's last reply is a bit more optimistic than what I would say. Partly because, sadly, I think that faith traditions are, you know, have awarded humankind enormous gifts, but also very sophisticated techniques of sweeping aside important things. Among other things, hearing God and doing the opposite. What I'm sort of trying to think about, and I'm no expert in the climate crisis and so on, but from the perspective of faith tradition, I would ask not what are the resources that we already have that might help us, because I think that against any one of those resources. We can have the opposite or the negative resource. But what is the new jolt that we can give ourselves, our leaders, our societies, or so on? And how would that jolt or shock, how would that translate into religious language? And once again, the paradox that I'm caught in with is that you would say, well, I know a jolt of that kind, let God speak. But we know for a fact that he may speak and we may not listen. So it's probably even something more profound than that, which I'm not sure what it is yet. I think I have a hunch that it could be explained or felt or heard from a religious perspective, perhaps a very syncretist perspective that combines different faiths. But I mean, sadly, I would say that faith traditions may be part of it. They would surely be part of the adaptation to new disastrous realities. But if we want to prevent them, how would that translate into a religious imperative? I'm not sure yet, I have to say.
Thank you both for addressing this space that's opened up for us that we have to face, this challenge that we have to face. We called our series, as we've said before, Hope Against Hope, and part of our job, I think, is to destroy some of the false hopes that religious traditions provide and engage with that space of trauma that we don't really understand where the future will lie. But I think also that we are waiting with ears, eyes open. That should be the challenge. Thank you both for what you've contributed today. It's been wonderful listening to you, and I'm sure this conversation will continue. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening, and thank you for your wonderful questions.